Chapter 1: The Forgotten Letters. The brisk air of early autumn whispered through the trees as Clara Fitzgerald stood in front of the old stone house, her breath visible in the morning chill. The house, with its ivy-covered walls and weathered slate roof, exuded both charm and melancholy, a reflection of the life it had once held. This was the home where her grandmother, Margaret, had lived most of her days, and now it was Clara's. At just 18, Clara had seen more of life's hardships than most her age. The Second World War had stolen her father and left her mother to fend for them both in a rapidly changing world. With her mother's reluctant blessing, Clara had chosen to leave the bustling city of London for this quiet village, seeking solace and a fresh start. The house smelled of age, of wood, dust, and faint traces of lavender that lingered from her grandmother's days. Clara spent her first day exploring its every corner, trying to make sense of the life her grandmother had led here. Though the house was familiar, having spent childhood summers visiting, it now seemed vast and unfamiliar without Margaret's warm presence. The attic, however, was a mystery to her. Accessed by a creaky ladder tucked behind a door in the upstairs hallway, it had always been off-limits during her visits. As she climbed the ladder, the wooden steps groaned under her weight, and she found herself in a dim, cramped space lit only by a small window streaked with dirt. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and dust motes danced in the thin ray of light cutting through the gloom. Boxes of forgotten belongings were scattered around, each one telling a fragment of a story she was eager to piece together. Clara spent hours sorting through them, old photographs, cracked porcelain teacups, and faded linens. Then, behind a stack of yellowed newspapers dating back to the 1920s, she spotted a wooden chest. It was unremarkable in design, but covered in a thick layer of dust, as if untouched for decades. The lock was rusted, but the latch gave way easily when she lifted it. Inside, Clara's curiosity was rewarded with a surprising discovery: dozens of letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly smudged, but still legible. Clara carefully picked up the first letter. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate, addressed to her grandmother, Miss Margaret Whittaker. But the sender's name was unfamiliar: Edward. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The words spilled out like a time capsule from the past. My dearest Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. The days here are long and grueling, but thoughts of you sustain me. I dream of the garden by your cottage and your laughter echoing through it. The promise of returning to you keeps me strong. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the rest of the letter. Edward was a soldier, writing from the front lines of the Great War. His words were filled with longing and devotion, painting a vivid picture of a love that seemed eternal. But this Edward was not the grandfather Clara had known. Her grandfather, Thomas Fitzgerald, had been a kind but stoic man, a carpenter who had lived a quiet life in the same village. He had never mentioned anyone named Edward. Clara couldn't stop herself. She opened another letter, and then another. Each one revealed more about Edward and Margaret's relationship. They had met in their youth, fallen deeply in love, and shared dreams of a future together. Edward's letters spoke of the war's horrors, but also of hope that he would survive and return to Margaret's arms. The letters ended abruptly after a dozen or so, leaving Clara with a sinking feeling. Had Edward not survived? Had his love story with Margaret been cut short by the cruelty of war? Questions buzzed in Clara's mind like restless bees. Why had her grandmother kept these letters? Why had she never spoken of Edward? And how had her life led her to marry Thomas instead? Clara spent hours in the attic that day, rereading the letters and imagining the young Margaret who had inspired such a deep and abiding love. She pictured her grandmother, not as the silver-haired woman Clara had always known, but as a spirited young woman with dreams and heartaches of her own. As the light outside faded and shadows deepened in the attic, Clara sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, holding the bundle of letters tightly. She knew this discovery was not just a glimpse into her grandmother's past, it was the beginning of a journey. The letters felt like whispers from a time long gone, urging Clara to uncover the truth about Edward, Margaret, and the life they had dreamed of together. Chapter 2: A Whisper from the Past. Clara sat at her kitchen table, the letters spread before her like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. The words on the fragile paper echoed in her mind, stirring emotions she couldn't quite name. She had to know more. The discovery of Edward's letters felt like the opening chapter of a mystery she was determined to solve. But where could she even begin? Her first instinct was to seek out Mrs. Harper, her next-door neighbor. Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman in her late 70s, had lived in the village her entire life and had always seemed to know every story about every family in the area. Clara bundled herself in a cardigan and made her way across the cobblestone path to the small, rose-covered cottage. Mrs. Harper welcomed Clara warmly, offering her tea in a delicate china cup. As Clara recounted her discovery in the attic, Mrs. Harper listened intently, her eyes narrowing with thought. When Clara mentioned Edward's name, Mrs. Harper's expression softened into one of recognition. "Edward," she said softly, almost reverently. "Edward Clark. I haven't heard that name in years." Clara leaned forward, her heart pounding. "You knew him?" Mrs. Harper nodded, setting her teacup down with a gentle clink. "Oh, everyone knew Edward back then. He was the love of Margaret's youth. They were inseparable. He was a soldier during the Great War, a fine young man with a sharp mind and a kind heart." But her voice trailed off, and she sighed deeply. "He never returned." The weight of those words hung in the air, and Clara felt a pang of sorrow for the man she had never known. "Why didn't my grandmother ever mention him?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Mrs. Harper shook her head. "Margaret was a private woman, my dear. She rarely spoke of her past. After the war, she married your grandfather, Thomas, a good man, but I always felt there was a sadness in her, a part of her heart that belonged to someone else." Clara's chest tightened. The image of her grandmother, always kind but with a quiet melancholy about her, took on a new dimension. It was as if the letters had opened a door to a part of Margaret that had been locked away. Eager to learn more, Clara decided to dig deeper. The next morning, she made her way to the village library, a quaint building with arched windows and shelves overflowing with books and old records. She explained her search to the librarian, an enthusiastic young woman named Lily, who was eager to help. For hours, Clara pored over local archives, reading through wartime records, newspapers, and personal accounts. She learned that Edward had been a lieutenant in the British Army, serving on the Western Front. His regiment had faced brutal conditions, and many of its men had been lost during the infamous Battle of Passchendaele. Edward's name appeared on a list of soldiers reported missing in action in 1917. The stark finality of the word missing left Clara feeling hollow. Had he perished in the chaos of war, or had he somehow survived and been unable to return? Her search in the library yielded another clue. Among the papers, she found an old village map dated 1910. On the edge of the map was a shaded grove labeled Lover's Hollow. The name was unfamiliar, but it sparked a memory. One of Edward's letters had mentioned a secret spot where he and Margaret would meet, a place hidden away where they could escape the world and dream of a future together. Clara felt a surge of excitement. Could Lover's Hollow be the place? The next day, armed with the map and her determination, Clara set out on foot to find the grove. The autumn sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light over the countryside. The path was overgrown, lined with hedges and twisting vines, but Clara pressed on, guided by the landmarks on the map. After an hour of walking, she reached the edge of a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. The air was still, and the ground was carpeted with leaves in shades of amber and crimson. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and Clara felt an almost sacred silence envelop the place. As she explored the grove, she noticed a moss-covered stone bench nestled beneath one of the largest oaks. It looked out of place, as if it had been carefully placed there long ago. Clara's heart raced as she approached it, running her fingers over the weathered surface. Carved into the stone were the initials EC and MW entwined inside a heart. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was it, their secret spot. She sat on the bench, imagining Margaret and Edward here in their youth, whispering dreams of a life they would never have. The grove seemed to hold their memories, and Clara felt an overwhelming sense of connection to her grandmother, as if she were bridging the gap between their lives. That evening, back at the house, Clara carefully tucked the letters away. The mystery of Edward and Margaret was far from solved, but she had taken her first steps in uncovering their story. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered what other secrets her grandmother's past might reveal. For the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of purpose. This was more than a search for answers, it was a journey into the heart of a love story that had shaped her family's history. Chapter 3: The Secret Garden. The letters from Edward painted vivid pictures of a special place where he and Margaret had spent countless hours dreaming of their future, a hidden garden nestled on the outskirts of the village. Intrigued by his descriptions, Clara set out to find it. Early one misty morning, armed with Edward's words and the old map she had found in the library, Clara began her search. The village outskirts were quiet, a patchwork of rolling hills, meadows, and narrow pathways framed by hedgerows. As she walked, Clara could feel the weight of history in every step, the faint whispers of lives once lived blending with the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. After an hour of wandering, she came across an abandoned cottage, its stone walls weathered and ivy-covered. Behind the cottage, tucked away from the main path, was a garden. At first glance, it seemed wild and forgotten, overtaken by nature. Ivy climbed up the walls of the cottage, and wildflowers had sprung up in vibrant defiance of the years. The garden had an untamed beauty, its overgrowth giving it a sense of mystery and timelessness. Clara stood still, her breath catching in her throat. This had to be the place. As she stepped further into the garden, Clara felt an inexplicable pull, as though the past was reaching out to her. She could almost picture her grandmother, young and vibrant, walking through the very same paths with Edward at her side. Their laughter and whispers seemed to linger in the air, carried by the wind. Clara decided, in that moment, that she would restore the garden. Perhaps in doing so, she could revive some of the love and hope that had once flourished here. She rolled up her sleeves and began clearing away the overgrowth. At first, it was slow work, pulling weeds and cutting back vines, but the effort felt deeply fulfilling. Each flower she uncovered, each stone path she revealed, felt like a small triumph, as though she was piecing together fragments of a forgotten story. It was during one of these days of labor that she met Henry. He had been walking by the cottage when he noticed Clara wrestling with a particularly stubborn vine. Henry, a young historian visiting the village to research his own family's history, approached with a friendly smile. "Looks like you could use an extra pair of hands," he offered, his voice warm and tinged with curiosity. Clara, caught off guard, wiped her brow and gave a sheepish laugh. "I won't say no to help. This garden has been fighting me every step of the way." Henry introduced himself, explaining that he had come to the village to trace his great-grandparents' lives. As they worked side by side, Clara shared the story of the letters and her discovery of the garden. Henry listened intently, his fascination growing with every word. "It's incredible," he said. "You're not just restoring a garden, you're uncovering a love story." As the days turned into weeks, the garden began to transform. Together, Clara and Henry cleared paths, pruned bushes, and planted new flowers, carefully choosing varieties Edward had mentioned in his letters. A sense of life and vibrancy began to return to the once neglected space. During their work, they unearthed small treasures buried beneath the soil: an old, rusted locket, a porcelain teacup chipped but intact, and a tiny, hand-carved bird that looked like it had once perched on a windowsill. Each discovery felt like a piece of a puzzle, a tangible connection to the lives that had once filled this place with joy and laughter. One afternoon, while clearing a particularly overgrown corner of the garden, Clara and Henry stumbled upon a stone marker. It was small and unassuming, almost entirely hidden by moss. Clara knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal an inscription. "For Margaret, my forever." Clara's heart clenched. Edward had created this garden for her grandmother, a sanctuary of love and dreams. She felt a rush of emotion, as if she could feel the weight of his devotion and the bittersweet tragedy of their separation. Henry, sensing her emotions, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He must have loved her deeply," he said softly. Clara nodded, her voice catching. "And she must have loved him, too. She kept his letters all these years. I just wish I knew why they were separated, why she never spoke of him." The discovery of the marker deepened Clara's resolve to uncover the truth. She spent her evenings reading and rereading the letters, searching for any detail she might have missed. Edward had described their dreams of a life together, a little home surrounded by flowers, laughter filling the air. As the garden blossomed under their care, so did Clara and Henry's friendship. They spent hours talking, sharing their own stories and dreams. Henry's passion for history and Clara's determination to honor her grandmother's memory brought them closer, their connection growing as naturally as the flowers in the garden. One evening, as the sun set and cast the garden in a warm golden light, Clara looked around at what they had achieved. The once-forgotten space now felt alive again, a place of beauty and peace. She felt closer to her grandmother than ever, as though Margaret's spirit was smiling down on her. But Clara knew there were still unanswered questions. The garden, as beautiful as it was, held only part of the story. The next step would be to dig deeper into the past, to find the missing pieces of Edward and Margaret's tale. As she sat on the stone bench under the ancient oak, Clara resolved to honor their love by uncovering the truth, no matter where it led her. Chapter 4: A New Connection. The weeks passed, and Clara and Henry spent most of their days together, working tirelessly in the garden. What began as a shared project had grown into something far more meaningful. Their conversations flowed easily, ranging from their personal histories to their dreams for the future. Henry's light-hearted humor balanced Clara's quiet determination, and Clara found herself smiling more often in his presence. One late afternoon, as they packed up their tools, Henry's gaze lingered on Clara. "You've brought this place back to life," he said softly. "It's like you've given Edward and Margaret's love a second chance." Clara looked down, her cheeks warming. "It feels like I found a piece of her I never knew existed," she said. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Despite the growing bond between them, Clara remained focused on uncovering the full story of her grandmother and Edward. The garden had yielded its treasures, but Clara felt there was still more to discover. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Henry called out from inside the abandoned cottage. "Clara, come here. You're not going to believe this." Clara rushed inside, her heart racing with anticipation. Henry was crouched near a corner of the room, holding a dusty leather-bound journal. It was hidden under a loose floorboard, he explained, brushing off the cover. Clara's breath caught as she opened the journal and saw Edward's name scrawled on the first page. "It's his journal," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she turned the delicate pages. The entries were raw and heartfelt, filled with sketches of Margaret and vivid descriptions of their time together. Edward wrote about their secret meetings in the garden, their dreams of building a life together, and the hope that sustained him during the war. Clara could almost hear his voice in the words, his love for Margaret pouring out in every line. But as she read further, the entries grew darker. Edward began to express doubts and fears, writing about the horrors of war and his uncertainty about whether he would return. The final entry was the hardest to read. "If this is my last chance to write, I want you to know, Margaret, that you are my everything. I dreamed of growing old with you, of watching the seasons change in our little garden. If fate takes me from you, please remember that my love for you was endless." Clara closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Henry sat beside her, his expression somber. He must have written that just before he never came back, Clara finished, her voice barely above a whisper. As they sat in the fading light, Clara realized the journal wasn't just a window into Edward's thoughts, it was a bridge between past and present, connecting her to her grandmother in a way she had never imagined. But the journal wasn't the only revelation that day. When Clara returned to her own home that evening, she decided to revisit the chest of letters. As she carefully examined its contents, she noticed something she hadn't before, a sealed envelope buried beneath the stack of opened letters. Her heart pounded as she held the envelope in her hands. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Edward's, but what struck her most was the fact that it was still sealed. It was addressed to Margaret, but it had never been opened. Questions swirled in Clara's mind. Why hadn't the letter been delivered? What could it contain? She debated whether to open it. Part of her felt it wasn't her place, but another part of her knew that the answers she sought might lie within. The next day, Clara brought the letter to Henry. They sat together in the garden, the envelope resting between them like a delicate artifact. "Are you sure about this?" Henry asked gently. Clara nodded. If Margaret had wanted to forget Edward, she wouldn't have kept the letters or his journal. She wanted his story to live on. With trembling hands, Clara broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Edward's words leapt off the page, filled with the same longing and devotion as his earlier letters. But this one was different. It was a goodbye. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I never had the chance to return to you. Please know that I fought not just for my country, but for the future I dreamed of with you. You gave me hope in the darkest of days. I only wish I could have been by your side to see the garden bloom and to tell you one last time how much I love you." Clara's voice broke as she read the final lines aloud. Tears streamed down her face, and even Henry's eyes glistened. "This letter was meant for her," Clara said, her voice shaking. "But maybe it was meant for me to find, too. So their story wouldn't be forgotten." Henry reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "You've done something extraordinary, Clara. You've brought their love back to life." The discovery of the letter deepened Clara's resolve. She decided to turn the garden into a space where love stories like Edward and Margaret's could be remembered and celebrated. But as she worked toward preserving the past, she couldn't help but notice the growing connection between herself and Henry, a connection that felt like a whisper from the very love she was honoring. Though the weight of history surrounded them, Clara felt a spark of hope, as if Edward and Margaret's love was guiding her toward a new beginning of her own. Chapter 5: A Bridge Between Generations. Clara held Edward's final letter to Margaret as though it were a sacred artifact. The words were tender yet heavy with the weight of a soldier's unspoken fears. His farewell was as much a plea as a proclamation of love. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "Though I may not stand beside you again, know that every moment I fought was for the life we dreamed of together. If I do not return, promise me you will find happiness, even if it's not with me. You deserve a life full of love and laughter, the kind we imagined in the garden. Carry me in your heart, but don't let grief keep you from living." As Clara finished reading aloud, her voice faltered, and she wiped away tears. Henry reached out, his presence a quiet reassurance. They sat in the garden stillness, the letter resting on Clara's lap. For days after, Clara reflected on Edward's words and the meaning of the story she had uncovered. Margaret had lived a full life after Edward's death, choosing to marry and raise a family, but she had never let go of the memory of her first love. The letters, hidden yet preserved, were proof that Margaret carried Edward with her always, even as she built a new life. This realization sparked something profound in Clara. The story of Edward and Margaret was not just a tale of love lost, it was a testament to resilience, the capacity to endure heartbreak, and the courage to find joy again. Restoring the legacy. With Henry by her side, Clara worked tirelessly to complete the restoration of the garden. The space, once overgrown and forgotten, now blossomed with vibrant flowers, winding paths, and a sense of tranquility. Clara planted roses and wildflowers in colors she imagined Margaret and Edward might have loved. She chose a small clearing in the garden to place a stone bench, carving into it the words from Edward's letter, "Carry me in your heart, but don't let grief keep you from living." The transformation of the garden became a shared project with the community. News of Clara's discovery had spread, and villagers began to contribute in their own ways. An elderly man donated antique tools once used by his parents, while a young girl brought seeds she had collected with her grandmother. Stories of love and loss emerged as people shared memories, weaving a collective tapestry of emotions that mirrored Edward and Margaret's tale. A ceremony of love. As the garden neared completion, Clara and Henry organized a small ceremony to honor Edward and Margaret. Invitations were sent throughout the village, and on a warm spring afternoon, residents gathered to witness the unveiling of the newly restored space. Clara spoke, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. She shared Edward and Margaret's story, not as a tragedy but as a reminder of love's enduring power. "This garden is a tribute," she said, "not only to Edward and Margaret but to every love story that has faced challenges, loss, or time. Love, in all its forms, is what carries us forward." As she finished, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, one by one, people shared their own stories, of sweethearts separated by war, of marriages that endured hardships, and of loved ones who left behind legacies of affection and courage. Henry, standing beside Clara, added his own reflection. "Sometimes, love isn't just about the moments we share, it's about the way it shapes us, even when the person isn't with us anymore." Clara's discovery reminded us all of that truth. A blossoming future. The ceremony marked a turning point for Clara. For the first time, she felt a sense of closure, not only for Edward and Margaret's story but for her own lingering questions about her grandmother's past. Henry, ever supportive, became a constant presence in her life. Their shared experience of restoring the garden had brought them closer than either had anticipated. Over time, their friendship deepened into a love as quiet and steady as the garden they had nurtured together. One evening, as they sat on the stone bench under a canopy of stars, Henry turned to Clara. "You've done something extraordinary here," he said. "But I think it's time we start thinking about the future we want to build together." Clara smiled, her heart full. "I think Edward and Margaret would approve," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. A bridge between generations. The garden became more than just a place of remembrance. It grew into a sanctuary where people from the village and beyond came to reflect, to heal, and to celebrate the enduring power of love. Schools brought children to learn about the history of the village, and couples visited to exchange vows under the rose-covered arbor. Clara kept Edward's journal and letters safely preserved, donating copies to the local historical society. She also began writing a book about Edward and Margaret's story, blending their romance with the lessons she had learned through her journey. For Clara, the garden was a bridge between the past and the future, a reminder that even in the face of loss, love had the power to endure and inspire. Years later, as Clara and Henry walked hand in hand through the flourishing garden, they often paused to sit on the stone bench, listening to the whispers of history carried on the breeze. The letters, the journal, and the garden were no longer just relics of the past, they were symbols of hope, resilience, and the timeless beauty of love shared across generations.